I bet I know how you felt this week. Think back about the news you consumed over the past 7 days. I'm willing to bet that at some point you came across a number. Maybe it was about job growth or inflation or prediction markets. And I bet in the back of your mind, there's an itch for just a second, a thought of, I don't really know if that's true. Uncertainty is an epidemic and numerical literacy is in a shaky situation. So today we thought we'd kind of have a state of the union on statistics, data, and the problems of obsession with big data without awareness of its limitations. Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast where if loving numbers is a crime, we've broken the law in every state. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buck, right here, with analysis expert extraordinaires, Doctors Nathan Woods and Steve Bronars. Nathan, Steve, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Brent.
Doing great, Brent.
And today we are joined by the author of Every Data, a book focuses on all the small instances we use data and the assumptions we bring to the table, Dr. John Johnson. John is the CEO of Edgeworth Economics and one of the leading econometricians working in the expert witness and consulting space. He has crafted analyses in antitrust, class certification, labor and employment, and damages-related matters, and also created the popular LinkedIn course, Data Analytics for Business Professionals, which explores the understanding of statistics and data as they relate to their use within business decisions. John, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys. Excited to be here.
Glad to have you. Nathan, Steve, John, I want to start out. What do you think is your favorite statistical test?
A Chow test, for sure.
Why?
Because the Chow test technically is about structural breaks, but I have been accused of being the inventor of the Chow test, which I try to tell opposing lawyers if it were my test, it would be called the Johnson test, not the Chow test.
Oddly, Gregory Chow didn't even invent the Chow test, but that's another story.
Do you have one? Do you got a test that you like?
Do I have a test?
The Chow test is fantastic. I'm not gonna go against that.
Given the other episode that we've recorded, I have to say the Fisher exact test is my favorite test. You know, it's a test that, John, I don't know, did you ever really come across it in academics in graduate school? I didn't. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it shows up all over the place.
Yeah, no, that is not a test that was part of any economics graduate training. Wouldn't show up at all.
No.
It's kind of one of those odd, interesting things where it's the type of problem that we wouldn't have dealt with in academia. So It's just a different application. But I guess that's part of what's so interesting about good graduate training and good training in statistics is it's not a cookbook. It's not like, oh, pull out my recipe and whip up some cookies by doing my Chow test. It's about having the ability to think about the problem in a unique way. That's what I think really good statistical training is about.
So you wrote Every Data and it came out in May of 2016. So we are looking at a decade now since it was released. How do you view the state of data literacy then versus now?
I would not suggest that it has improved. Look, I think that things that have changed the most is shockingly, the amount of data is actually continued to grow exponentially. So that's a big difference in 10 years. I also think there has been a general climate of distrust in our society about expertise, about finding your own alternative facts, things like that. And so you can't really divorce the many changes in the political climate in the US, in general dissatisfaction with institutions from how people view numbers. We would like to think that numbers are the objective basis by which we can get to facts and understand phenomenon, but I don't think people view statistics more carefully. I think people are more prone to pick up on the statistic that they like that supports their position.
So when I think about books like Every Data, they kind of fit in a group like maybe Nudge or some of the other books that are specifically where an author is trying to explore some way that people are thinking about a common problem. And what I think a lot of those authors come back to is a reality that some of the things that we assume and view about the world, they feel almost innate. Do you think there are any statistical issues or data issues that you've got where you realize even yourself, I'm falling prey to some of the problems that you point out?
Absolutely. I think it is a constant need for vigilance. I mean, one part of understanding data and thinking about data is the pure volume of data. So There's one part of it just you can be exposed to numbers constantly and it just wears you down. It's exactly like decision fatigue, right? It's the exact same notion that if you're just bombarded with information, you let your guard down. I always joke that, I'm partial to like Instagram posts with sort of the newest, latest technology that'll do this or that, or the old school, I'll really date myself. Well, Steve will probably know the Ron Popeil infomercials where they have like the rotisserie chicken maker. And like,
Sure.
I always thought those infomercials with the data, that's amazing. I can make my chicken in 10 seconds. Unbelievable. I think we all have confirmation bias. We all have to do that. But for me, it's always, why did I buy this thing on Instagram again? Oh, yeah, it's going to make me 10 times smarter, 10 times faster.
I mean, one of the things that we've talked a lot about, I think, has been the need for people to be able to go back and look at older numbers that, like, we talk a lot about the BLS and their revisions. How do you view that vigilance that you just mentioned? That, like, can the average person really keep looking back at numbers? Is there something that needs to change culturally, or is it based off of institutions? There's so much information that people are getting constantly, and there's a lot of skills and tools that you can develop on your own to have good habits. But what are the sources that we can look to try and change how basic data literacy is working?
Well, I think the notion of retrospective studies is a fascinating, actually, area of academia, where, I think of the first set of studies in the antitrust world where they started to ex post look at consummated mergers. And so after a merger, one of the things when you do a merger review is you're looking prospectively. If these two companies merge together, what's going to be the effect on the market? And particularly, what's going to be the effect on prices and what's going to be the effect on consumer choice and things like that. And so a series of academic studies started to ex post look at consummated mergers and say, well, what were the actual consequences of those? And I think that's sort of a fascinating, really exactly in the sweet spot you're talking about. Now, that's a fairly academic example, but let's step back and think about that in our everyday lives. I think the more important the question is to you, the more incumbent it is to study the data more closely. Can we deal with, or do we have to understand the reality that even the best of data might have problems? Yes, that's part of what you're looking for. But I think for a lot of questions you might seek to understand, you're not exclusively the expert, but there is expertise out there. There are things you can read, and there are things that are credible and there are things that are not credible. But yeah, I don't think people have the time to become amateur statisticians. I think we should pick and choose the questions we're trying to answer and make sure we're focused on that. And before we make big decisions, if you're going to make a big decision, I think you would be incumbent on you to say, okay, let me do a little bit more research versus, if I spend the $20 on the Ron Popeil chicken maker, well, I'm out $20. Okay. It's probably more than $20, but you get the idea.
Especially inflation adjusted. I want to open up the conversation a little bit. Steve and Nathan, you guys have been working in economic consulting now over this full time. How do you guys view the change in data literacy, or maybe the way that you view the volume and expectations around data?
Well, I would say that, first of all, I agree with John that there's just like an explosion of the amount of data that's out there. And I do think there's this confirmation bias. So you see a study and it kind of conforms to your expectations and maybe you don't question it as much. And you see something that's different and you go, they probably messed that up. There must be something else going on. But you don't really have the ability to, nor is it usually presented in the media in a way that you could figure out very easily exactly what they did to arrive at that answer. So I don't think we're worse than we were before, but I think there's a lot more that is put out there in the news media that you have to try to evaluate. And it's a difficult thing to do. It's always been difficult. And now there's even more of it. And I do agree with John that everything has become kind of partisan or tribal or whatever you want to say. And so whatever the fact is, it's always kind of used to make some other arguments rather than, hey, let's just focus on this. What was the effect of X on Y? And why do we think this study turned out this way? And so that's where I think we're kind of at.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the use of data in public spaces, that cynicism and distrust in institutions, all of that's been said. I think in terms of my own experience over 25 years, the biggest difference is there are huge volumes of data, but the tools that we have to manage all of that data have kind of grown with that as well. And so, what I notice the most is people are in a rush to know what the data say. and out of proportion with the speed with which or the tools that have developed with those large sets of data and large volumes of data. It still takes some time to think and reflect, look at the data, see what it tells you, diagnose it, take a moment to build it, check it, hopefully check it a lot, and then start coming up with some answers. And I feel like relative to 25 years ago, you get an engagement now, they're saying, well, how soon will we know the answer? 25 years ago, they said, we'll talk to you in a couple of months, because it's going to take you that long just to build the data and start answering anything. So to me, that's the biggest thing that's changed in 25 years.
I mean, thinking about the volume of data, the tools we have, thoughts about kind of expertise. Do you have any concerns about, there are technical tools that we have now that are way better than what we had before to run regressions or get specific different outputs much faster. And you don't actually have to know how to do matrix transformations or operate a punch card system to enter in your information. Maybe you didn't need to know some of those components, and so you're able to spend more time on the things that are actually useful. But do you have any concerns about the accessibility of tools versus the danger of misusing that tool?
Yeah, I suspect this is the same discussion that was had when calculators came about, when the earliest computers came about, that, you may not know how to do the math. You may not know how to do the programming. And I can think back when I was a graduate student, Stata, this program that you can do regressions, we used to have to hand do the matrices and nobody knows how to do it. So I think there is a danger of that, but I also think there's a benefit in that we can, again, if you are well trained in thinking about the key parts of the question, we can create incredible efficiencies with these tools. When we were talking about this big data, about this evolution of questions and answering quickly, when I think about all data analysis, and to full confession, this could be because of how I was trained and who I was trained under at MIT, but causation is the question that when we deal with data analysis, we spend all of our time on. So whether I'm putting together data quickly or slowly, whether I'm thinking about a certain technique, at the end of the day, I want to answer a causal question. And that in some respects is the highest standard you can hold yourself to when you do a statistical analysis. And so that is about thinking. That's not replaced by the fact that I have a faster, better tool. That still requires sort of a foundational conception of the problem. And I think to the extent those tools free up people to think about the problem more carefully, that can be a benefit. But yeah, there's also some people, I can remember undergraduates, I'm like, you just ran that regression and you don't have any idea what that means, but you ran it.
You ran it.
Great.
Yeah, it ran.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, good. The minimum threshold, it operated.
I've said this in expert reports. Regression is a tool. And just because you run a regression doesn't mean it's useful or meaningful. It's that perspective on how you're structuring the question, how you're structuring the analysis, and what it means that is the critical insight. And I really think that is the essence of good training and good statistical work, is the ability to frame questions effectively that will allow you to answer the question you care about.
And really, to follow up on what John is saying, it's really an econometrics, even more than just statistic issue about the causality, because as we talk about all the time, we're not running experiments, controlled environments to see what the effect of particular inputs might be on the output. And so there's more theory involved and more, how are we going to try to get at this causal relationship, given that we're, largely relying on observational data. And that's where I think there's been a huge amount of work that's been done over the last few decades, trying to figure out clever ways. And, John's advisor and other folks at MIT really contributed to that kind of field of study, because ultimately, John's right. That's what we were trying to get at. I mean, correlations were done a long time ago. You can still do correlations, but it's really getting that causal relationship figured out. That's the most important thing.
Wait, sorry, what was it your advisor did?
Oh, sorry.
I don't know. I don't know your advisor.
Right.
I'm the
win a Nobel Prize.
I know the things.
All right. So
we're going to get his advisor on next.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm very fortunate. I have the honor of having worked with not one, but two thesis advisors. The two co-signers of my thesis are both Nobel laureates.
Wow.
And so my primary advisor was Joshua Angrist, and my secondary advisor was Daron Acemoglu. And so Josh has an entire, his Nobel Prize is in part for his contributions to the estimation of causal effects. And everything that he has worked on in his career has been about taking these unique problems and finding out what is the true causality under the surface. And so whether that's in education, the military service, gender wage gaps, it's just a tremendous breadth of research, which has created an entire generation of economists who think rigorously about causation.
Howard, I'm kind of curious now about this. So I feel like when I was in school, I learned not a ton of econometrics, but some. And we would read papers and there'd be some theory about how the world works and then a model that you'd try and use to map that out. And then you come work for an actual consulting firm and you've got the actual data for like how companies are running. And the on the ground version can sometimes feel pretty different than what the theory might predict because of different ways that a company might operate or a bunch of different factors. With something like the work you were doing with these advisors versus the work you're doing now, how do you think about that, the mapping or the transformation to the more practical, hey, there's a company that's being sued under an antitrust allegation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was fortunate that and it's partly sorting, my advisors were empirical people who cared about as many real world questions as they could. But there's no question the first biggest difference, and you hit on this, is the quality of the data that I get access to in this job is so much better than anything I ever got in the academic world. We get detailed, highly confidential data access in litigation or in a consulting role where we get to see the real micro level data. So that's one thing. With respect to the causal questions and the sort of point you made, well, I think about when I was an undergraduate, the same experience, so excited, I'm going to run a regression. I think I did a undergraduate thesis on the determinants of state lottery revenues. And I was all excited that I had advertising and all these cool variables in my regression. And it was completely endogenous, which just means everything was jointly determined. You couldn't tell anything from it, but I was so proud of it. I had a statistically significant result. After going through a lot of graduate training, you realize, you have to think about how you shape these questions. The discipline of shaping the question is still the same as when I was an academic. The techniques can be different. The difference here, I think, is that in academia, often the shiniest, newest bells and whistles get more credit, whereas in our work, getting an answer that is credible is the first and highest importance. And so if that means it's a simple regression or a simple comparison can do the trick, you don't get bonus points for also doing some other cool technical technique. So you go as far as you need to credibly answer the question, whereas an audience for a publication might be different. But still, that exercise of can you carefully answer the question you care about is still the same benchmark.
In some ways, the academics are more, I agree with John, they're very concerned about techniques and what's the latest technique. And sometimes you can tell reading the paper, they're more interested in that than what the problem they're studying. In some instances. In the expert report world where there's this adversarial relationship, you have to turn everything over and the other side is going to look at it way more carefully than referees and editors and all that do. This is a different process in many different ways. And one of them is that there aren't as many replication studies in academics as like we would do in a typical month at Edgeworth, where you're trying to figure out how did the expert on the other side get a result that they did? What are the key assumptions that enter into that? And that just is a very important part of this understanding what's driving a particular empirical result. And it would be better if there were more replicability type studies, I think, in journals. There's a ton of journals. There's a bunch of papers that are out there, and some of them probably wouldn't hold up to the kind of scrutiny that we go through as experts.
Yeah, you want more of the antagonistic approach applied to academia. Maybe every journal has to have an anti-journal where they're constantly trying to foil each other.
I think it's interesting. I mean, in our lifetime, so basically think about from when I was a graduate student 25 years ago to today, one of the things that academic journals started to do is now you have to, in an empirical paper, you have to make your data accessible. And that wasn't the case back in the days.
It was not.
When I was publishing papers as a professor, I would be lucky if 10 people looked at my work and maybe somebody occasionally would ask for the data set. And then You might have a discussion about, well, what are you going to use it for? Because you're basically asking me to be your research assistant. I clean this data set and now you're going to take it, and what would you do with it? I always try to draw this contrast when I'm explaining the difference in this job in this world is that the standards, and when you know someone is going to scrutinize every word you write, every data analysis you do, that is an incredibly high standard. And so I always push back on people like, well, professional consultants or expert witnesses, you're just going to say whatever your client wants you to say. Well, you can do that once, I guess, but you don't get to do that more than once, because at the end of the day, there's someone on the other side who's equally smart, who's going to push on every single assumption you make. And so the way I approach my work, and I think this is pretty much uniform across Edgeworth, one of the things I'm proud of our firm is we are thinking hard, we're being diligent, we are doing the best possible work, we're acknowledging the limitations of our analyses, and we're thinking hard about the data. But there's going to be somebody on the other side that's going to keep you honest. And I think any young expert only makes the mistake one time of stretching too far. And then when they get their knuckles wrapped because they went too far, they never make that mistake again.
Thinking about the broader decline and in value and respect for expertise and discussion about why are experts important. How's any of that discussion seeped into the way that you think about presenting information in this line of work?
Yes, I think it has in the following sense. I've always, as an expert, I've always tried to position myself as a teacher, because that's what I am, right? Whether it's a client, whether it's a judge, whether it's a jury, at some point in any engagement, I am being asked to explain things as simply as possible, but as credibly as possible, because I have an expertise where I can teach someone something that is useful and credibly answer their question. So when you approach your work that way, are there people that are automatically cynical of experts? Yes. Has the degree of cynicism probably increased over time? Yes. Are people often in a courtroom going to view you skeptically? Well, of course they are. It's an adversarial process. So I think in some respects, the kind of work we do had to sort of build in the ability to think about that issue long before the backlash against expertise more general.
I think when I look at numbers in public and I talk to friends, there are times where I'm trying to convince them that the number they believe they're seeing is probably not what that number is. And that if we looked at the underlying description about how the data was collected or how it was generated, you'd have a much different view of the number that's being cited. And I think that some of those, the skill of being able to look at numbers in that way comes from the work that we do and the steps that we have to take to try and explain and tell the story of what's actually happening in data. I'm curious if there's any ways that you think differently about that storytelling exercise because of the social data literacy, like attorneys maybe not understanding numbers in the same way as they used to, or there are now maybe more attorneys who have multiple discipline approaches.
The way you ask that question, it's very interesting because I've got a string of different answers. One is I've got a 17-year-old kid that has a lot of crazy ideas about stuff. And there are times when I'm trying to help him understand why he shouldn't be relying on those facts, where you just get exhausted.
Yeah.
and you think to yourself, this is my downtime. I do this at work. But when you're at work, it is your professional responsibility when you're talking somebody through a problem, as John was kind of describing, to walk them through it and to point out all the assumptions where it's a little bit softer, where it's stronger, where you've tested this is robust to a whole bunch of different possibilities, or maybe it's not. And you kind of walk people through that. I don't feel like in our professional relationships that I run into people that are as cynical or as distrustful. There's something about you're in the line of work and you've retained us for a reason, where you're accepting some basic, you need an expert. If you didn't need an expert, you wouldn't have gone to the trouble to call us. So I don't think I run it into that part of the challenge like I do with talking to my kid.
My thoughts on the general question there is that part of the reason why it's difficult in the outside world, in the mass media world, to really understand what's going on is that you get one result, one test statistic or one coefficient or one empirical relationship, and that's, the headline. And then you don't really understand from reading the story what they really did. And like John was saying, in the old days of publishing, you didn't turn over all the data, but you described what you did. And so you could figure it out. You figure it out much better if you can get your hands on the data and look at the code and all that. And the way in which a lot of people interact with the information that's out there is it's based on some study that relied on some assumptions and did some kind of an analysis, but it's very hard to tell what generated that result and how sensitive it is to different kind of specifications and assumptions, et cetera. So I think that's kind of why, in my view, people look at this stuff and go, I don't believe that, or I don't believe, I see a result that was very different from that just a few months ago on a similar kind of study. And that's unfortunate that people then start distrusting analyses and experts and all that. I think for me, what John was talking about, the difference between academics and being an expert witness, over time, my view of that has really evolved because it really is a situation where it's not just every analysis you do, it's every sentence you write. Like, why did I write that sentence? There's no article that you would write that people would come back and go, why did you write that sentence in section 3 of that article? Like, you don't worry about really defending that, but man, you do as an expert.
One of only 10 people would have asked you that question because
that's
and they're ready.
Yeah. So it's a different game that's being played here in the expert witness compared to academic publications. Although John is right, it's getting better because you have to acknowledge now where your funding comes from. You have to provide the data. So they're catching up a little bit.
And look, I don't mean that to insult academia. There are incredible academic papers and people that do really insightful research who hold themselves to that standard. But I'm just saying more broadly, there isn't a single piece of research that I work on as a economic consultant that doesn't get scrutinized in every direction in every way. That is just not a level of attention that any academic paper I ever worked on got that type of attention. So that is a discipline device for all of us. When you know that, that's sort of going to make sure you're thinking hard and you're going to state your opinion, not only because that's what you should do as an honest broker expert, but also somebody on the other side is going to look at it closely. So that is the discipline device that is built into the legal system that I actually think works quite well.
Thinking about the possibility that someone's able to review the work you did, take a look at the data, your methodology, your results, and then looking at what is now much more pervasive, which is the use of data and AI. We've got all these tools for synthesizing data and trying to explain its contents with large language models, but that is a black box for, I think, most of those models. You can't really look in and see what's going on or explain how numbers are produced. And you've got a lot of people who I think are using those as almost like a Google search shortcut to understand the information that's out there. How do you view data use in AI in and out of a litigation context?
We don't have an hour and a half, so let me sort of see if I can simplify. I try to be thoughtful about the adoption of new technologies in general. As someone that runs a firm, as someone that owns a entrepreneurial place, I like to think like an entrepreneur. I have been preaching at our firm to be slow to adopt AI tools, to make sure we understand what they are doing and what they can't do, to rigorously test. That's why we've done phased testing of things. We don't use, obviously we can't, and we don't use any sort of our confidential information on any public AI tool. We put in place certain guidelines and then rules to make sure that we are not using it just to sort of do the analysis, but instead that we're actually bringing that same rigor, because at the end of the day, we are still being hired for our expertise. Then there's the broader issue in general about AI is what is it good for and what is it not good for? So you can pick up Law 360, which is sort of one of the publications we get on a daily basis, and you can read about some legal brief that has hallucinated a case where a judge has now issued another sanction against a lawyer, and a lawyer is apologizing for this made-up case that AI hallucinated. You can do a search yourself, and you can find all sorts of hallucinations. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't information there, but what was the old phrase, trust but verify? Or, verify and verify and verify and verify. So I think of it right now, and maybe I'm understating its ability, as a more sophisticated search engine, but I am surely not at the place where I am willing to defer statistical analysis to AI tools, except in very controlled environments. that's the way I think about it. And that's just being smart about the advances in technology.
I have to say that the most recent ABA conference that I was at, I heard the word hallucinated more than at any other conference I've ever been to in my life. So it was a very common thing. I think the other thing is I saw this interview with Alex Karp of Palantir, and he made this point, and he's a brilliant guy. People agree with him, but he made the point that these companies that are doing new and innovative things, when they're using some of these frontier LLMs, they're sharing their data with that company that provides that large language model. And that data is valuable. And he was talking about how this industry, which is developing very quickly, might evolve because, in his view, businesses should be careful about sharing data that has some, trade secrets and other things in it that would get out there. And so I think we still don't know how this is all going to play out outside of the expert witness world.
I mean, I will tell you, Steve, I got an email last week, a spam email that said if a person could buy our company's data for between $50,000 and $2 million so they could train their AI model on our confidential data. I put that in the reported that as spam.
I feel like when it comes to a lot of the tools with AI, that I find them sometimes helpful to utilize our closed loop system to kind of understand a little bit more the parameters of a statistical test. But I always have the concerns because I've seen AI usage outside of that give me slightly wrong information, or maybe doesn't fully understand the context of the information it's giving, that I'm not getting a complete picture on what a statistical test is supposed to be doing or saying.
Well, I think that, look, like any tool, you have to be aware about the capabilities and the limitations. So when you describe the ability to use AI to understand a statistical test, let's say, for example, the investigation can't stop with asking, ChatGPT, tell me about this test. You have to actually then look at the sourcing, look at the information, what other information you have at your disposal. And also, you're basing that in part on some base of knowledge that you've built up over the years with your expertise. So I think if we view it as a tool and we think about what are the strengths, what are the limitations, that's the key to effectively using a tool. And then over time, as the tools evolve, we will be able to determine what it can do credibly, what it can't do. I don't think about my calculator anymore. If I add 2 plus 2, it's going to give me the right number. So over time, it may well evolve, but it is very much in its infancy. And so we have to be extra cautious about what we rely upon it for.
Steve, were you ever worried about your abacus calculating?
I never worried about that. Never worried about that. I feel like some of the models, and I think they're going to get better over time, but they're telling you what you want to hear. And that's all my take on the hallucination thing. Wouldn't it be great if there was some study that showed this and they'll make it up? And it's, because they're trying to help you and trying to give you the answers that you want to hear. And that's a little bit annoying when it's something they completely made up. Right? It's like, yeah, I really if there isn't a study out there showing this, or there isn't something like that. So I am just thinking you got to be very skeptical of it at this point. It's going to get better, like John said, over time. You're not asking questions about like, can I trust these numbers? But a very rapidly developing area. So the next generation will be better and better.
You wouldn't rely on a research assistant who came and just made up a study for you. And that's what you wanted to hear.
That's what I want. Because I think it's being trained on these conversations and the back and forth, and it knows what you would like to hear, and it will sometimes tell you that, even though it's not true. And it just, you got to get better at prompting things.
On 10 observations. Sure. So, John, you've also worked on some LinkedIn courses with data and AI. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about those and what your goal with them was?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to develop a relationship with LinkedIn Learning, which is the arm of LinkedIn that produces basically short to even long-form courses on different topics. The first course, Data Analytics for Business Professionals, I actually recorded shortly after Every Data came out. And then in the last year, I went and sort of updated it. And so that course is kind of a practical training for business people that have to deal with data in their everyday lives. where we take them through some case studies and sort of some different types of problems with little mini data sets and thinking about what you could learn with statistics and the like. That course has been very popular. There's been hundreds of thousands of students over the years that have taken that course, which is pretty mind-numbing when I think about it. Then more recently, I recorded a second course with my colleague, George Lynch, with AI and data analytics, which is sort of starting to broach these issues of what do AI tools do and where can they help, or where do you need to be cautious when you think about using them for data analytics? And it sort of follows that same theme of sort of case studies that try to walk you through different types of examples.
So I think one of the great benefits of instructing someone is that you're actually able to see how they engage with and respond to the material. And if you're a teacher in a classroom, those students are right there. If you're trying to help an attorney understand what an analysis you've done is, they're right there to give you feedback or questions. How has it been? Have you gotten good feedback from these LinkedIn courses, or is it something that is a little bit different in that kind of didactic style?
Yeah, it is different because they are pre-recorded. It's not like I'm interacting with live students. There are some, not through LinkedIn as I understand it, but there are universities that have programs where they are teaching online. And obviously that's what all of COVID was teaching online. But I do get feedback both because there are questions that students submit sometimes. I think what happens most often is I'll open up my LinkedIn and I'll have like 10 messages from someone that's taken the class and posted, I just finished this class by John Johnson. And then all their friends like it. And all of a sudden I have like 20 new followers. And so it's kind of that's sort of this interesting ex post celebration of the class.
I was at my brother's working remotely, and I was on Slack, and I thought that I maybe had called you or something because I heard your voice. It's coming from a computer. And I turn around, my brother is listening to your instructive videos, but for a good 10 seconds, I was freaked out that I had actually dialed something incorrectly on my phone. And now I'm calling the CEO. This is the reply. This is like the send all of Zoom. So are there any other courses that you guys are thinking about, kind of developing?
What I've been spending my time on right now is more on my antitrust course that I teach at Georgetown. I'm going to be teaching that again with one of my other colleagues, George Karenko. And so I'm spending time on that right now because that's another, I like to teach. This job gives me the opportunity to teach in a courtroom, in a consulting setting to business professionals, but it is also good to sort of step back into like the academic world a little bit. What I try to do is put all of these years of knowledge in perspective. What do I think is important that I learned, and how can I convey that to students? And so what's always interesting about antitrust, particularly because it overlaps with our topic today, is that antitrust is a very empirical and statistical field where a lot of the way I've made my contributions is by bringing econometrics to those questions. Our course is heavily on econometrics to sort of teach students how to think about it in the context of these type of issues we deal with in this world.
We've talked a lot about the way that people used to apply data analysis, the way they currently do, and some of the tools they've got available to them. I want to think a little bit prospectively. What are the big concerns you have about the way that people are consuming data, the way that people are looking at numbers? Do you have concerns that, because things are becoming more accessible and people are thinking about them less, and we've got algorithms that are driving people down particular paths, that it's going to be more difficult to make people data literate?
It's going to sound like such a classic economist answer. On the one hand, I think accessibility is not a bad thing. I think if things are more accessible, I think that the key to democratization of learning is making things accessible. So I think when things are accessible, when you can teach, when you can spread good habits, when you can sort of allow people to have to engage, I think that's a good thing. I do worry about the velocity, the speed with which numbers get churned, the speed with which people are taking on numbers or being bombarded with them, that neutralizes or impairs their ability to think about what they're consuming. And so that reality is important. And then if you think about the volume of data and how much bigger the data sets are getting, really thinking about what the insights are that can be drawn from those data sets is going to be another, I think, interesting challenge, but an important.
Yeah, I think I worry a little bit about I think if it's important enough, people will dig and might be more receptive to different viewpoints, different data sources, conflicting data sources, and sort the whole thing out because it's an important enough thing to them. that they'll go to the trouble. For kind of low cost, just conversational stuff though, I feel like everybody is just taking whatever is handed to them and they're running with that and not thinking hard about it one way or the other critically. And maybe that doesn't matter because maybe that's mostly just for their own entertainment value. But as long as people are willing to put the time and effort in when it's an important decision and then maybe do rely a little bit on the experts that might be around them, whether it's us or just the people that are saying like, you should try this really good restaurant or you should go to this grocery store, which is unlikely to sell you something that's going to make you sick. Whatever that feedback is, if it's important enough, I think they'll rely on that expert opinion. And that's, I think, good.
Brent, when I heard your question, what I immediately was thinking of was the fact that in the U.S., for the publicly available data, the government data, we're very concerned about privacy. We top code certain things and bottom code and don't report cells in certain tables because there aren't enough businesses or individuals in that category. And it might, someone might be able to work backwards and get that. And so there's a ton of information that's out there that private companies have access to, that's in the ether that's out there. And I think the way that we kind of handle with the government data, it's a lot different than it is in some European countries where it's easier for researchers to get access to data that is you wouldn't normally see here. And so I think that we got to really, the privacy is very important to us and all that, but there is a trade-off in terms of we're going to fuzzy up the data or anonymize the data that the public can see in order to protect privacy. It's not going to be quite as accurate. So I think that'd be something that I would look at it like, because there's a bunch of questions that people have asked about the BLS. Why are they still doing surveys? Isn't all the employment data out there, on some server? Like, yeah, it is, but no one's going to turn that data over to you. And so there's surveys and non-responses and noise that gets in there just in this one example. And, ideally you could figure this all out, but that would have a lot of privacy concerns. So I wonder where that's going to go in the future.
Yeah, I think the thing that worries me about data literacy going forward is the thing that worries me about data literacy today, which is that people have selective skepticism about data, that you might trust a source if it confirms your biases, but argue against it the second it reports a number that you don't like. And so having some more uniform application of skepticism, or at least an awareness that maybe every single number can't be treated as if it's sacred, I think would be helpful.
Also, I think the real world is complex, and we should think about the fact that an anomalous result, a result that doesn't go in the direction you think it is actually a gift in terms of thinking about what is going on. And, I'm far more interested when I see something where results point in a given direction, but then maybe one thing doesn't, than seeing something where it looks way too good to be true, right? Statistics are inherently, there's going to be noise. There's going to be anomalous results. So you have to think about that. I'm really skeptical when I see something where you just say, wow, every single thing I see is going in the direction of what I believe.
Interesting. Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is more likely? The universe is going in your favor?
Well, at least today.
Yes. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, John, for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Really great to be here.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions. Thank you.